Tonight I'm going to talk about two women, as George said, are vastly different. I created this little chart at the last minute. It's actually an addendum to the presentation, but I thought I'd talk a few minutes about it at the beginning. It's an attempt to place this issue of where women fit into Western culture. This is not world culture. There are differences. So I've created these 5 columns here by centuries. The first one, 0 to 1700 CE, is sort of arbitrary because there really are some feminists in the Renaissance in the 16th century and before this. But 1700 seems to me a better date because there are more of them. And it is the time of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. And I've characterized each of these, as you can see. And the first part, women are virtually invisible. If you know anything about the Old Testament, there are maybe 4 or 5 of them in there, and I think they got in there by accident, I'm not sure. But anyway, that was my attempt at comedy. So, all right. The next part there, 1700 to 1900, is when the idea of the equality of women begins to emerge, because that's when the concept of equality in Western culture emerges. That's when we begin to think about this. You must remember that in that time period, 0 to 1700, women are considered the devil's gate. They are still in many parts of the world. That's why in the Middle East, women wear the burqa, because the idea being if women didn't wear the burqa, they would be an inescapable temptation to men. That was the Middle Ages in the West, in Europe as well. The 1700 to 1900, a number of things emerged there that make it interesting, because women become visible more or less in Western history. But it's really not till the 19th century that issue develops as a movement, as I talked about in the last couple of lectures. One thing I want to draw your attention to is this phrase I use called the rise of not men. What I mean by that is around 1900, 1910, from 1870 to 1910, the secretarial positions in business became women. Before then, there were no women in offices. And then all of a sudden they were. Well, because we had the typewriter, the telegraph, and eventually the telephone. And so men were considered too important to do those things. So women invade the offices, but culturally there's no place for them. At that time, the bustle is eliminated. The bustle was a piece of attachment. Initially, 1840, 1860, it really was a wire cage that tied in the back, and you put pounds of crinolines over it. By the 1880s, it became sandbags. Truly, it's funny, but it's true. And by 1900, they're gone. But the idea of who women are isn't quite caught up, hasn't caught up with that. So they're not really culturally, so to speak, women, considered in that fashion, and they're not really men. So, but they can do some men things, i.e. secretarial work. So I call them not men. I don't mean anything pejorative by that. As we move into our century, or the last 20th century, separate but equal, we have that, except that the Equal Rights Amendment fails twice in the 20th century, once in the 1920s and once in the 1970s. And then speculation about the future that I'm going to talk about at the end of this presentation, which I call gender fluidity. I mentioned in one lecture before the way in which we might deal with equality of men and women is simply not call them men and women, call them something else. so that I wanted to do this little thing of a sort of context. Tonight I'm going to talk about these two women, and probably many of you know who Audrey Hepburn is. Why is not moving here? I don't know. Okay. Maybe this is not on. Okay. So the sort of the subtext of this is style is meaning, because it really is. Sex is equality, because in the 20th and 21st century, we've come to realize that equality means bodies. It's not a spiritual principle up here, it's here. Expression of meaning in sex in literature and film. Again, in the 20th and 21st century, sexuality invades the public. You cannot ignore it, nor should we. So what does that look like? This is a long quote in which I tried to frame that idea. And the idea here is style. Many people, I don't know, perhaps you have this stereotype, I don't know. I think many men of my generation, it certainly did, that style is something frivolous. You know, whenever you think of style, it's a stereotype. I think of women in their underwear dancing around on a magazine page that says, "Oh, don't take me seriously," kind of idea. Fashion and style really is much more serious than that. It is an attempt to create an image, to force people visually to see you in a particular way. I think that's very important because, unlike men, although men are not oblivious to style, they certainly are, very much, if not more vain than women, but at any rate, it's certainly there. Style is a way for women to assert a right to exist in a public sphere, to exist as some kind of an equal, even though she might not look like an equal, so to speak. Sorta. Remember, in the 1930s, women start to wear pants. Pantsuits were very popular among movie stars, for example. And then in the late 20th century, pantsuits for women are virtually ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So that what this is basically saying is style is a way to make meaning. When you present yourself in public, you are making meaning. Other people will see you in a particular way. Maybe it's not what you want them to see, but that's what they will pick up until they have a chance to interact with you as an individual. So, Audrey Hepburn is perfect for this because she comes out of World War II, as you'll see in just a moment. She was birthed in Holland before the Second World War, lived through the Nazi occupation of horrific events, starvation, disease, and she almost didn't make it through World War II. The other part of it is, after World War II in the West, people don't want tragedy anymore. Culturally, what we're looking for is something more upbeat, something more positive. That is not to say there are no movies that are tragic, but very few of them made in the United States. Most of them made in France. There's a small portion of film noir, dark film, in the late 1940s that exists for about 3 years and then it disappears. So people are looking for something more that reflects the prosperity that they exist in, but it is a prosperity protected by nuclear diplomacy, which is the idea of prosperity is, there's an old movie starred Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, no relation to Audrey, called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and it was about integration in the 1950s, racial integration. A young woman brings a black boyfriend home, and happens to be Sidney Poitier, who could you get more beautiful than him? Anyway, the title of the movie is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? So I thought, well, the bomb came to dinner in the 1950s. And accompanying it is the idea of massive retaliation, which meant if they launch, we'll launch everything and we'll kill everybody in the world. So nobody would be insane enough to do that. I don't know, we did it in Tokyo. At any rate, nevertheless, Western wealth is the ideal. That's what people want to have. That's what they want to become in the post-war world everywhere. That's the ideal. We had a time period in the 1950s through about the mid-1960s perhaps, in which American goods were something everybody wanted. Nobody wanted those foreign cars except for 18-year-olds who couldn't afford anything else. But people wanted those Chevys and Cadillacs, and they wanted them all over the world. It wasn't just here. And they were, of course, a symbol to the whole thing. Ostentatious wealth. You may or may not remember the Cadillacs of that time with enormous fins on them. And I think they got 3 or 4 blocks to the mile. I'm not sure. But anyway. So the point here being that there's this concerted effort on many levels of world society or Western society to make an ordinary life because World War II was so tragic and so extraordinary. There's the bomb that came home to dinner, the atomic dining room. I love that. And this even better. Why, of course, swimming. If you have if you have a bomb shelter, well, you're going to have a swimming pool, of course. I mean, what else would you do? In between nuclear attacks, right? Anyway, Audrey Hepburn fits the role perfectly as what I call the Ms. 1950s. She's vulnerable, she's slim, and she's extremely stylish. Beyond, there's an old term called clothes horse. Audrey Hepburn was beyond that. I think what was going on. She made movies. Certainly movies were controlled by patriarchy, and we're very well aware of that these days with Weinstein and all those scandals. But back then, the patriarchy was invisible. By patriarchy, we mean male-dominated. Okay? They have the money, they have the executive positions, they make the decisions who makes the movies and who doesn't make the movies. And certainly she fits into that. The prime idea here is Sabrina, a movie that was remade again in the 1980s about a young woman who is the daughter of a butler to a very wealthy family, and she falls in love with the scion of the family, the heir-to-be. But I do want to bring one thing out to you about this. I don't think that Audrey Hepburn would ever have been vehement about women's equality, but I think she was nevertheless. And here's why I say that. This is a new book of poems called The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one by Amanda Lovelace. And she has another book called The Princess Doesn't Die in this one. It was her first book. But here's what I mean by the seriousness of what's going on. She writes little short poems, and here are 2 of them. Red lipstick, an external sign of interior fire. We tried to warn you. Red lipstick, battle cry, battle cry, battle cry. We tried to warn you twice. That's the sentiment, I think, behind what Audrey Hepburn is doing, even though these were not written in her time. I think it reflects what she was about. She's very serious about style. So these are some facts of her life. The interesting part, I think, that people forget is how many films she made. And she had 5 Oscar nominations for those films between 1953 and 67. This, of course, there she is. How can you not love this woman, huh? You know, there's Gregory Peck, right? Okay, and I'm sure his hair is dyed. When this movie is made, Gregory Peck is not quite so young, but he looks like it, you know. And of course, what's interesting about it is how old she is and how old he is. And that theme occurs again. So here's a film historian who says, you know, she scooting around the eternal city on a Vespa, a little motorbike, you know, you can just see this. She's a wisp of a thing. She's 110 pounds, you know, and just not much over 5'5". This is from Sabrina. On the right there is William Holden. They wanted to get somebody else to play his older brother, but they couldn't get him, so they got Humphrey Bogart, and Humphrey Bogart hated him. He thought that William Holden was too much of a flake, not a very good actor, not to be taken seriously. But the key point is, look at her. This increasingly is the ideal of women, what women are supposed to look like in the culture in the 1950s. The other movie here that also plays on the theme of older man, younger woman, of course it would be. There are no young men in movies in the 1950s unless they die, i.e. James Dean at the time, because the patriarchy isn't young men, it's older men. And so it fits perfectly, and you know, like the t-shirt says, the old guys get the young girls. I don't know about that one, but anyway, that was what made this movie so scandalous. It wasn't that the immorality of the movie. I mean, what we're talking about is an extramarital affair, basically. That's what the whole movie's about. But the real ruckus is the differences in age, which tells you something about the 1950s. This is not a cause for concern. People don't seem to worry about that. This today would be outrageous. Probably most people remember her at least for the nun story that she did. And again, there's an ideal here. This movie came out when I was in 8th grade, and every girl in my class wanted to be a nun. And I was taught by nuns. And the nun would bring in her bridal book, because nuns were called the bride of Christ. So they had just like a wedding. She wore a white dress to her initiation as a nun and so on. And the black comes afterwards. Of course, in this movie, Audrey Hepburn falls in love with somebody, and the film historians say, well, that was her finest performance. But if we look at it culturally, is this some reminder that, okay, here's Audrey Hepburn, and she's this adorable fairy tale princess, but is she something else? Are women supposed to be innocent in the 1950s? Yes, they were. That's the cultural image. Most people also remember her for Breakfast at Tiffany's. Tiffany's is a jewelry store, which now does, in fact, have a restaurant in it, a coffee shop. And she played a character called Holly Golightly. And the tragedy of the story is she could never have the diamonds she lusts after. This is another story. There's Cary Grant, and just appropriately gray. Don't you love that, you know? Just a touch, you know, so he doesn't look like her father, so to speak, you know. And there she is, My Fair Lady, which caused a great deal of concern because Julie Andrews was originally supposed to be cast for the part because she could sing. Audrey Hepburn could not sing, at least not to carry a tune over a film. So those songs were all dubbed. But she looked better than Audrey Hepburn, than Julie Andrews. So here we have an idealized version. But keep in mind, behind that ideal, there is a woman who has a life, who wants to say to the public, you think I am this piece of fluff, but I'm really something more than that. I made who I am. Audrey Hepburn made fashion of the 1950s and 60s, literally. Her partner was Givenchy, the French couture. They collaborated on all of her dresses, and interestingly enough, you'll love this, maybe you won't, I don't know, she could walk into his dresses. No alterations necessary. Do you know what that means? Waist about this big. So, My Fair Lady as the ideal here. A shift now to Susie Bright, literature. She's still alive, 1958, so that makes her about 58 years old, approximately. Anyway, reflective, sexual, and critical. And she's all of those. But look at this. That's one of her books that she edited. It's called A Collection of Erotica. There is also her as everything. This is an image of femininity that flies in the face of the culture that says women are sexual, women are caring, and women are powerful. Look at how she's attired. This is not Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn would never appear in this sort of attire. There she is more currently as a reflective person. This long quote is from one of her books in which she says, I didn't set out to be a sexpert. It just happened because she learned to write very well. She has an MFA, and she says there, reading and writing probably above all other personal pastimes, but she never thought that would become an idea. I use the word fallenness, and I don't mean that in the cultural sense of the word. Here's what I mean by that. In the 19th century, women who were not proper women were called fallen angels. There was something wrong with them. They had descended from divinity into, for God's sake, bodies. So that, I don't mean that. What I mean here is she represents the culture itself, falling out of the idea, culturally, that we don't really have bodies. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever thought about why men go to health clubs and why they do all these insane activities? You know, well, they would say, well, they want to be healthy, you know, and this, all this. BS. The whole issue is because they can't stand the fact that they have bodies. They hate them. Women don't have that problem exactly. Men will punish their bodies because they hate them. That's what I mean by fallenness, the idea that the culture is being forced to accept the fact that we are bodily beings. This is a great quote from one of her books. In the trenches of lust, unfettered by partisan opportunities, who have been the ones who test honesty, respect, privacy, and honor without false pretenses. We're covered in mud because that's where we're close to the ground. Again, look at the qualities she's talking about here. She's taking sexuality, making it public, and saying, wait a minute, it's not what you think it is. There's something else going on here, and that is moral qualities of honesty and respect, and so on. This is not her. This is by another writer who proposes these aspects of feminist pornography, as she calls it. And there is a tremendous difference between male pornography and female pornography. They're vastly different. I don't think most men would recognize that what they're watching in terms of feminist pornography is even pornographic. At any rate, because of those three principles. Women must be involved in the production, writing, and direction, and they are increasingly. Women must work in the film, and there must be genuine feminine pleasure that is depicted here. That is, it's not focused in on the male's pleasure. Or the piece must expand the boundaries of sexual representation. To go on, that first phrase, I think, is the most important one. The representational branch of the erotic. Okay? Porn as the representational branch of the erotic. That the erotic, in order to have legitimacy, has to be there in the public. And if this stuff is tied to issues of equality, femininity, the legitimacy of women having sexuality, okay, then it has to be governed in some way. And she's saying creative, humane, no harm, links to sexual longings from various systems of oppression. Rape pornography in the male pornographic world is very prevalent. And what she's saying here is, no, that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what's going to go on. Oh, what did I do? Okay. That's just the citation. Here's more of Susie Bright and where she's coming from. A true sexual revolution. I don't know about some of the older people in the world. During the 1960s and 70s, I kept looking for the damn sexual revolution. I never found it, you know. At any rate, they said it was there, but I never found it. At any rate, the sexual revolution to bring about a change of consciousness, and that's the important point. There's the connection of body or mind, body and mind there in consciousness. Nowadays, there's probably not a single American woman my age, and she's about 58 or 59, who doesn't understand what menstruation means, but are there women who nevertheless are utterly mystified about every other aspect of their genitals? Yes. If you were in attendance at the Eve Ensler performance just a little while ago, this is exactly what she's talking about. Female orgasm is crucial to female power. Why? Because men can have them, and men can have them legitimately. That's the key point here of the whole thing. So she's saying a place that isn't entirely commercial and driven towards the most formulaic common denominator. Public expression of sexuality in literature and film gives everyone a chance to explore who they are as human beings. Free, equal, fun-loving, and connected to other people. These are not qualities that we like to talk about as ourselves, but they're real nevertheless. Why put them under the table? Sex is about freedom, connection, and equality. This little piece, I don't know if you're aware of this, but sexual promiscuity is rampant in Silicon Valley. But it's all male-dominated. If women become objects of sexual desire, they're locked out of credit, they're locked out of advancement. They're virtually over in terms of Silicon Valley. So this young woman says, look, you know, what do we want? Well, what do people want? A chance to be whatever it is they want to be. When this was written, sexual harassment scandals had not yet come into the public media, but they're very much there. The fourth point, I think, is extremely important. Are men to have sexuality and women not? That's the point she's making. If men have sexuality, well, either they're having it with other men or they're having it with women. So what are those women? Do they not have an equal opportunity to explore that sexuality? About erotic writing, Miss Bright, I'm sorry I misspelled it, I just realized. We take the realities of sex in our era into the slices of life that we write about. And what she's writing about is equality here. With the early reformers, the issue was voting rights, as I pointed out, among other things, but that's the prominent one. Now, what we're looking at is the right to be sexual as women. And the question then becomes, what does that mean? What does that mean as women? What are we talking about here? Here's a nice quote from one of Eve Ensler's books that she writes, "Tell the image makers and the magazine sellers and the plastic surgeons that you are not afraid. That what you fear the most is the death of imagination and originality and metaphor and passion. Then behold and love your body. Stop fixing it, it was never broken," is what she's saying. Here's another little piece from Amanda Lovelace, little poem. It says, "I appreciate every roll, every scar, every acne mark, every extra pound, every stretch mark, every misplaced hair, every bit of cellulite, and the only body I have." That's what Eve Ensler is talking about in her books as well. Eve Ensler is the one who is famous for what was called the vagina monologues. Early feminists then point out that what we're looking at is the right to be human, and that's what Bright is talking about. It simply isn't fair, nor, I would put it to you, moral, to ignore the idea that we have bodies, to pretend that they don't exist, and that we are somehow all spiritual and angelic creatures. And what she's saying is, when she looked into this stuff and started writing about it, she said, women have as much sexual fantasy as men. Sexuality is about a connection, then, at both our most foundational level as who we are as human beings, as well as transcendent. Both are going on there. Orgasm is about the immanence of the self and others, the presence of the self. Sexuality is about freedom, connection, and equality. It is the fun of presenting ourselves. What I mean by that is something that George Herbert Mead and D.W. Winnicott both talked about, the issue of ourselves being multiple. We're not just one person. We have multiple sides. I don't know if you've ever encountered this, for example. You have a set of friends here, and you have a set of friends here, but you don't mix them. Why is that? Well, because over here you're one person, over here you're another person. Is that just simply an artifact of existence? No, it's a reality of who we are. Are you not over here a real person? Of course. Are you not over here a real person? Of course. Then what are you talking about but multiple selves? Not in some schizophrenic way, not in some paranoid way, but in a real way. We're different people in different situations with different people. And so George Herbert Mead talked about that in the 1930s. D.W. Winnicott, who is was a psychiatrist, a pediatric psychiatrist, and said, look, you know, how do you learn how to do stuff? Well, you play at it, basically. You have fantasies, you have imagined scenarios, you might do things. Play is a very serious thing. So, sexuality then is also spiritual. It's the blending together of the super self that I call me and thee. On the plane of me and thee, one finds the thou, I think. The holy other being who inhabits us, who is the horizon of our being, that to which we say there is an absolute principle that we refer to and say, well, that's the rock bottom, that's the foundation of what is true and real. The interesting part about this, of course, is, and Bright brings this point out, that sexual participants have to be committed to the pleasure of each other in that interaction. If it's one-sided, it's not about equality anymore, it's about dominance. And that's the very thing that she wishes to get rid of. And trust, I think, is something we sorely need today, okay? Here she is, the modern Inanna. Inanna was a goddess of Sumer. And here is a poem in praise of Inanna. Inanna's powers are prodigious. She is capable of making love through the day and the night. She is a cosmic force that descends from heaven to earth. Not only is she a spiritual vision in dreams, she is the awakening force that stirs love in men and ripeness in plants. Love that last time, don't you? So the question is, this picture back here, this is a modern rendition of who Inanna is. And she's angry, as well she should be. How can angry young women who feel oppressed and who are oppressed then find equality and trust? How is that possible? Well, I think one way is, of course, men have to change. I cite here Carl Jung. Carl Jung said, "How do you know what women look like, men? How do you know what men look like, women? Who are they supposed to be?" Here's a funny story. A long time ago, there was a movie called M, and it was modeled on the idea of Madame Butterfly. Madame Butterfly, the opera, was about a Japanese woman who fell in love with an American naval captain in the 1860s. He goes away and gets married, forgets about her, but she remembers him. She says, "I'll be here when you get back." And he gets back, and he doesn't remember her. And of course, she commits suicide because he's not worthy of her, nor is any other man. So, what Carl Jung says, in that movie, M is about a French diplomat during the Vietnam War who has a love affair with a Chinese opera star. There's the kink there. In Chinese opera, the female parts are not played by women, they're played by men. Well, the unbelievable part of the story is he has a love affair with her for 9 years and doesn't recognize that she's a man, not a woman. At one point, this opera star is talking to her Chinese runner, her agent from the Chinese Secret Service who's running her, and he says, "Do you know why the parts of women in Chinese opera are played by men?" It's the same thing Shakespeare said. Because only men know what women are supposed to look like. That's very Jungian. What it means, people might take that as pejorative and say, well, you know, don't women have independence? Of course they do. But the real point here is all of us have a part that's feminine and a part that's masculine. Not in the sense of any sexual connotation or gender connotation, but simply there's a part of us that feels and a part of us that acts. And we call those two principles female and male. Jung did. So how might this work into the issue of equality? Well, here is the modern Dionysus. Men must become, Dionysus is the god of ecstasy, wine, sexuality. And with that presence, if men are willing to allow themselves to have a feminine side expressed, then women can guardedly engage with that. And here is what I call the American goddess. Okay. When you then bring the two opposites together, okay, this is a quote from Hinduism, when we bring apparent and opposites together in love, we can enter a state beyond normal consciousness, a sense of oneness or unity. This is the depiction of that in Buddhism and Hinduism. It's called Yab-yum, the blending of the male and female in equality. Notice this picture. They're on the same level. That's the key here to the whole thing. They are equal in this engagement. So, who is this thou that I'm talking about? Well, I don't know, the community of all souls, the Sangha of Buddhism, of all past and future Buddhas who now are together in the seventh heaven. Are they the cosmic us, the supersensual connection of all humanity? Yeah. They're all of those things. Harold Evans, J. Harold Evans, who's a psychologist, a theologian, and a Methodist minister, has written a number of books about the issue of sexuality and spirituality. And he writes here, the important point is libido, sexuality, is present all the time. We have this whitewashed term, desire. What are we talking about here? This is sexual attraction that we have to all sorts of things. So he says, and I love this, whether you're sitting in church at worship, meeting for a business or a pleasurable party, we are always aware of the gender of those around us. He goes on to say, sexuality and spirituality are not two different things. And this is where Yab-yum is going, to the idea that they are the quest for human being. They're two different sides of the same coin. So that what Ellens is doing here is, of course, rehabilitating the idea of sexuality. Sexuality isn't something that we talk about under here. It's something that's present with us always. Instead of being under the table, instead of being hidden away, it's something that we whisper about. What he's saying is, it doesn't matter what you think God is, you still have sexuality. He goes on to say, in the Old Testament, this guy is a theologian, okay? He's studied this. He says Old Testament people thought penises and vaginas were as godly and godlike as philosophical minds. I love that quote. He takes issue with St. Paul, who is very difficult to deal with. Perhaps he's wrong. St. Paul, he interprets as someone who has a conflict between body and spirit. I don't know if that's true. My impression of St. Paul is he just took up Greek philosophy so he could talk to Greeks. In Greek philosophy, they are radically separated. Bright doesn't say these things, okay, that I've just pointed out from Ellen's there. But she does write at the junction of that dilemma. And again, the dilemma that we're looking at here is the connection between body and spirit. That's what all this stuff is about. If we don't make these changes, then this is what will remain. I would point out that the things that I've talked about were framed in heterosexual terms, but I mean this to apply to the LGBT community as well. So here's some other pieces that I would like to read. Unfortunately, I'm a man, and here's a woman's poem, so please excuse that and take the meaning rather than the gender. She writes, "Women are considered to be possessions before we are ever considered to be human beings. And if our doors and our windows are ever smashed by wicked men, then we are deemed worthless, foreclosed, never sold. So we move out of our neighborhoods and we make our sister homes with each other. Again, she writes here, this is a great little poem. We finally refuse to be seen only as bodies crafted for men's use and consumption. So we set the clouds ablaze to sway them, to show them how wonderfully we could coexist. But they chose to take it as a threat, and they have never fully forgiven us for claiming a portion of the sky that was always rightfully ours. Again, what she's saying here, as you can gather, it's really very straightforward, that the oppression of women has been a millennia long. We're not just talking about a few decades here. We're talking about thousands of years. Isn't it about time? The sentiment behind those poems is, isn't it about time that men and women treat each other as equals in all aspects of their lives, not just in public? So, if we don't do this, if we don't look at ourselves honestly as human beings, as Bright and the others are suggesting, what's going to happen to your future and your future? 2040, 45 is when Elon Musk says artificial intelligence and humanity will blend together. So you'll have a very efficient brain, but who are you? I think that's a question we're not asking as our culture. And so I would leave with this. This is an old Gaelic song by, I don't know if you know who Sinead O'Connor is. Some of you do. This is before she became Miss Tattoo of Great Britain. At any rate, this is a great song. Here's the translation. Hail a woman who was so afflicted. Of course, she's singing about Ireland, but it applies to what I've been talking about tonight. Who was so afflicted, it is our ruin that you were in chains, our fine land in the possession of thieves. And again, you know, the lines fit perfectly. Men have stolen women's sexuality and made it their property. Our fine land in the possession of thieves while you were sold to foreigners. Welcome home, welcome home. Let me end with this, just a little piece, a few lines. Let me just recite them for you. Amanda Lovelace, I read your book, smiling so strongly my lips cracked. I love the power of your heart, the flames of your soul, and I am ashamed. I am a man, I regret all the evil men have done to women. I want to make reparations, but there are none, are there? Because we can't erase the past. We could let you be, but where would we be without you? Women so fair, women so lovely, women so seductive, women so strong, women without men. Did it all begin in Eden? Did we men make the fatal mistake and blamed you for it all? Can we not be friends again in paradise where we once had joy in each other? Not today, I guess. Maybe tomorrow, when men know better. In the meantime, grow strong so that we can, in the future, be warriors together again, defending each other, loving each other, friends to the last, lovers forever. A dream? Well, maybe, but let's try. Thank you very much for attending this evening.